Welcome to a very special session of Demystifying Technology for Food Innovators. In this series, we talk about the most influential technologies involved in food production, and we try to translate them into a plain English conversation. At least that's what we hope. I am Nestor Gomez, the Chief Technology Officer of the Canadian Food Innovation Network. And today, my guests are Rosita Dara, Associate Professor of the School of Computer Science at the University of Guelph, Ontario, and David Shipley, CEO and founder of Boss Around Security, a cybersecurity company out of Fredericton, New Brunswick, Canada. David is struggling with his browser at this point, but he will be joining us briefly. Rosita and David, eventually, welcome to CFIN and welcome to Demystifying Technology. How are you, Rosita?
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure. I was looking forward to this conversation today. So why don't we start with a brief introduction, Rosita? I understand that the first part of your career was in the tech industry, and then you moved into academia. Can you explain your job as an academic and how it relates or connects to technology, cyber, and the food industry in general?
Sure, absolutely. As you kindly indicated, I'm a faculty member at the School of Computer Science, University of Guelph. Previously, I worked at BlackBerry and also for a short period of time at the Information Privacy Commissioner's Office. I was kind of a research scientist in both organizations, and I was involved in mobile health, building data, basically platform for mobile health platforms, and also I worked on IoT and using AI to protect privacy. So when I came to University of Guelph, I built an interdisciplinary research program, which kind of, with specific application to agri-food systems. This research program has several pillars. My background, my research academic background, is in the area of artificial intelligence, machine learning. Basically, that was the core one. Cybersecurity, more specifically on privacy and confidentiality, and generally speaking on data governance of information systems. But my current research program, being at the University of Guelph, I decided to apply my skills to agriculture and food. My research program has four pillars. First of all, improving cybersecurity, more specifically focused at the farm level, but also at the supply chain level. And so we are looking at regulatory and best practices on protecting farm data from a privacy perspective and a confidentiality perspective. So we have looked at existing regulations and how they protect data. As you know, regulatory landscape in Canada is also changing with digital charter, which may impact some farm data. But also we look at some of the existing codes of conduct and best practices. So on security side, we are working on raising awareness, publishing papers or other guidelines for protecting farms, which could potentially be a weak kind of sector in terms of security. Developing best practices and also building technologies. For example, we are working on collecting data to build threat intelligence tools for farms, especially for the network data. Now, the benchmark data for network data is limited. I mean, there is non-existent at the farm level, and that data can have its own characteristics. So it's best if we train machine learning with farm-specific data. The other pillar is on ethical and responsible use of data and technology in agri-food. So especially we look at the impact of artificial intelligence system in agriculture and the use of an ethical and responsible use of those systems. Interoperability is another area that I focus on, especially on standardization of data and technology and legal processes, because we have to look at these tools if we want to make them more secure and efficient, we have to have a view of look at them from a platform perspective. And one of the other areas that I try to address in all of my research, I think the human aspect and human factor in all the technologies that are being built, whether it's for privacy, security, and food specifically, is missing. We don't pay a lot of attention to that much attention to these tools to be human centric, to be inclusive. So that's another pillar that kind of we consider when we are designing new technologies, processes, protocols, throughout all the other pillars that I mentioned, which is cybersecurity, ethical and responsible use of data and technology, and interoperability.
Thank you, Rosita, for such a detailed explanation. And I want to center this conversation around the human aspect, mainly because our focus here is to help the food innovators in the food industry, and I want to help them to understand what are the priorities in cybersecurity. So, David, thanks for joining us. I'm sorry you had a few technical issues. You also have a fascinating career that goes kind of in the opposite way. So you started from a military background, and then you studied journalism and moved into academia and then into the private sectors. What opportunities did you see in the private sectors that made you think I can come up with something with a better solution for this problem?
I think one of the benefits that I have coming at this from a liberal arts perspective versus a computer science perspective is that I can bring the humanities to match the excellent work we've done on the technology side. And why I think that's so important is it goes right to the back of the meaning of the word cyber itself. And we dive into what it actually means, where it comes from. It's from the Greek word kybernetes, which means the helmsman or the steersman on the ship. And given my browser troubles, I'm not feeling like I'm fully in control of technology, but the analogy still holds. So why did Norbert Weiner, the inventor of cybernetics, the father of the field of cyber that we now use now, why did he choose this Greek word? Because it illustrated, if you picture at the back of this Greek ship, the three common and key elements of cyber: people, the person at the back of the ship; technology, the oar, the rudder, the steering wheel in their hand; and control. And so I believe that our future is positive when people are in control of technology. And let's not make any mistakes. We need technology to survive as human beings, and we need the promise of technology unleashed in the food sector to meet the demands of what the UN now says is 8 billion human beings. So we need this stuff to work, and we need to be in control of it. And what I find fascinating is that when you get this right, when you help people make really good risk-based decisions, when they understand what they gain and what they lose when they implement technology and how to become resilient, we can unleash that potential. And my last sort of academic hat that I'll put on is the word technology is a fascinating word to me because it's a warning. If you go back to the original Greek words techne and logos, which means the art or the skill of building something, techne, and logos, which combine with techne, means the careful consideration of what you gain or what you lose when you build or you use that thing. But we wield our technology so irresponsibly that we don't realize that it's got a warning label on it. And it's incumbent on all of us. And I think, Dr. Derry makes a really great point. From the farm straight to when it lands on the table, how are we using technology responsibly to meet the needs of Canadians?
I love that context because that is a great segue to what I want to ask next. To maybe we'll start from you, David. Let's go straight to the point of the most recent cyber incidents that I've known of. Essentially, the one reported by Maple Leaf and by Empire in the last couple of weeks. But there are other cases that I know are out there in the food industry, specifically the Molson Coors incident in March 2021, and also the JBS ransomware attack that cost them $2 million and $11 million, I believe, to each one of them. So, what do we know about the most recent cyber attacks, and are there other significant examples that you want to mention in the food industry, David?
Yeah, so right now Empire Co. is the nightmare scenario that kept me awake for quite some time. I think Nestor, you and I had lunch in Fredericton, and I was outlining like what would be the worst day or worst possible thing that could come to mind, and an attack on the food distribution retail side of things was top of my list. So we now know through public reporting and through information gained by a technology website called Bleeping Computer that it appears Empire Co. is the victim of a ransomware attack, with the gang behind that ransomware attack known as Black Basta. They're a fairly new gang, but they are a rebrand of a previously prolific gang. And so these are a lot of the times the same members coming back into operation, with some strong evidence from cybersecurity companies that the DNA of this particular gang, their tools, their tactics, their procedures, looks a lot like a famous Russian hacking group known as Fin7, who collectively have made $1 billion. These are smart, well-operated, well-oiled, well-resourced cyber criminals, and they work business. And typically, their demands for ransoms are in the millions of dollars. So, that's what we know. Bleeping Computer says it has seen the ransom notes. There have been screenshots posted by employees to social media of everything from the measurement equipment, so the weigh equipment in stores, to managers' back office computers, showing the typical ransom note.txt file. So that's out there. We don't know how Black Basta got into the environment. We know based on previous reports that phishing is a popular technique that they use as the initial side, with malicious macros still being quite popular, and then a combination of Trojans like Quackbot or stolen versions of pen testing tools known as Cobalt Strike. Either way, badness ensued, headaches are happening. Anecdotal reports that are working their way back to me indicate that this is a full-on and extraordinarily difficult couple of weeks for the IT teams involved with Empire, which I want to be really clear, I feel a great deal of sympathy towards. It is extremely difficult to defend a 1,500 store, national, publicly traded company. There's no other way to put it. And so this is my sharing of this and reflection on this, and is no way, shape, or form about victim shaming. It is, however, about understanding that if Empire Co. got hit, others will be hit. And the food sector is, pardon the pun, on the menu for cyber criminals now in Canada. So that's the reality we're dealing with. What we don't know is whether Maple Leaf's incident is related to the Empire Co. incident. So timing is fascinating. You have a Thursday night, Friday incident in Empire. You have a weekend incident declared with Maple. I don't like the timing of that. If you generally have these gangs, and I think the message here for the Innovation Network is they work networks, they work supply chains, either up or down. So I think that's the thing that has my attention right now. And traditionally, when you look at the food industry in Canada, this is not a margin-rich industry. Whether it's from the farm right to the table, these are thin margin businesses, and we haven't had the push to invest in cybersecurity. So that's the sort of latest situation. That's the threat environment. I think it's the first of many, and I think the food industry is going to need help to protect itself.
Thanks, David. Rosita, you want to add anything to that for the sake of context between I know you're more focused on the ag side of things.
Yeah, sure. So I just wanted to, so cybersecurity is, we usually think of ransomware or when the system becomes unavailable, which is quite true. Those are the most common security issues and incidents. But we have to also keep in mind there is a rising, at least conceptually, the potential attacks on an AI system, and which can disrupt, kind of farms or a supply chain. And the way these attackers, they aim for changing, poisoning the data. They aim for changing or poisoning the parameters of the machine learning or AI algorithm. And they try to reconstruct some of that data and then change it in a way that the decision that the machine takes, or the action the machine takes, is completely different. And those are a type of attacks that unfortunately sometimes it's very hard to detect. This type of attacks would potentially will be on the rise. They're a little bit more complicated because the attackers should have some knowledge of the machine, of their performance, and of what the task they are given. But they could happen. It could happen in one farm. Potentially, they change, for example, something regarding the operation of that farm. But that could be. But as we know, AI algorithms are trained with a large number of data from different farms, and the operation in many farms could be impacted. And by impacting operations in farms, maybe using too much pesticide or fertilizers, the impact could be on environment. The impact could be for a long period of time, and the impact may go beyond few farms, and it could impact the region and a country. So these are also alarming attacks that we have to keep our eye on. That may be rising in food, basically supply chain from farm all the way to retailers and consumers.
I think you make a really good point, Rosita, and just to add in, people might wonder, like, well, what would the motivation be for someone to cause that much chaos? And we have to remember our geopolitical situation is now extraordinarily unstable. It hasn't been this, I guess, this hostile since the end of the Cold War. And, we have seen macro level moves to disrupt industries as part of countries position themselves competitively. We are seeing a strategy where Russia is putting the grain supply globally under threat as part of its moves. Canada is a major player in that food production side of things. So I think your point is spot on, and it could become part of the weapons used as part of a larger geopolitical story. The other thing that keeps me awake at night, Nestor, is we saw an example. It was funny until it wasn't. We saw an example of $40 million or so worth of John Deere equipment stolen from Ukraine, and John Deere tracked it via GPS, and they disabled it remotely, which, we all got a good laugh out of, haha, Russian thieves didn't actually make off with anything, except now they also just highlighted they have that capability to disable equipment globally. And they just, pardon the pun, poke the bear. So our smart appliances, our smart technologies for food production, they themselves could be weaponized against us.
So how do you see now that it's a question that is in the back of my head for a long time now? How is the position of Canada as a country? How would you rank it globally in terms of risks and the food industry in particular?
So I will briefly comment on this, and I will pass it on to David. So I don't think so. So this is one of the issue. Until a few years ago, at least in US, digital agriculture or food supply chain or agri-food industry basically wasn't a critical infrastructure. And it wasn't a high priority in the past. Only in the past few years, it has been recognized as a critical infrastructure, meaning that previously the reporting attacks or measuring those or making sure that we are on top of that and reporting breaches, it wasn't a top priority. It's gradually becoming one. And we cannot immediately switch to, kind of having a formal and kind of systematic procedures to report it. I think we are gradually hearing about these. I mean, we are hearing about these attacks, but the exact number is completely unknown to us compared to other industries. For example, healthcare is known to be quite sensitive industry to this type of attacks and privacy breaches and security breaches. Banks as well, financial sectors. But I think with agriculture, we still need to put the right infrastructure to keep track of the number of attacks. And at least based on my knowledge, this is maybe in a few years we will get there, and we are able to report and we are able to measure a little bit more systematically. But at this point, I think we don't have enough information to say where. I'll pass it on to David, but I don't feel we can firmly mention that where we are standing in terms of our cybersecurity infrastructure for food, for agri-food.
I think you raise an excellent point, Rosita, is that we need the data. And I'm not convinced that we are set up or even thinking about it legislatively to gather the data. And the reason I say that is I've spent an extensive amount of time as part of my work with the Canadian Chamber of Commerce and the co-chair of the Cyber Right Now national campaign, diving into C26. For those who aren't familiar, this is an act respecting cybersecurity. It's changes to the Telecommunications Act, and it is a critical cybersecurity safety protections legislation. However, the legislation, as it's currently presented, is focused on federally regulated sectors related to banking, telecommunications, energy transmission, and transportation, which have very clearly in federal jurisdiction. But to Rosita's point, once again, we're making a critical mistake that food is critical infrastructure. I imagine the folks who are watching this webinar involved in this industry, you take this as granted. I don't know how policymakers miss that Maslow's hierarchy of needs pyramid class. I remember getting that in sociology in my first week in university. If you don't have shelter and you can't eat, you are not worried about existential questions. So, we know this is important, and yet, as a country, we seem determined policy-wise to stick to rules established in the 1980s with our Constitution, or in 1867, the British North America Act. Guess what? It's 2023 soon, and we need to have modern government institutions, ideally protecting Canada, but certainly putting in place the structures that you can actually call and say, my food production firm has been hit by a ransomware attack, help me. And I think I really, really want to hammer this point home, is that expecting Canadian individuals and private sector firms, the food industry, et cetera, to defend itself is such a break in the social contract between citizens and the state. And we need better. And there's no way we can expect the food industry to spend its way out of this without further aggravating the very issues that we're seeing around inflation. So this requires federal government help.
Yeah, one quick note: we need regulations. We need to make at least, I think, some of the sectors within the food industry are able to report security breaches and privacy breaches. Even that needs to be a requirement to at least report it. I know in US it has been a few years, they have made agriculture critical infrastructure. Obviously, you have to build the platforms, you have to build the infrastructure to be able to report it even. Because if we are not monitoring, we are not aware what's being attacked. And they said I was speaking with somebody, and they said in 2-3 years they would be able to systematically report it as much, most of the incidents. Most of them, not all of them, but also that's a good number. So I think Canada needs to start looking at what other countries are doing, and they have to take actions accordingly.
And I think, Rosita, you said something really, really, really prescient, and I want to reinforce this point. When we're talking about farmers in particular at the farm level, we have to make sure we're building technologies secure by default that are easy for them to use in safe ways. I mean, I think it is completely unreasonable to expect small farms in Canada, even our larger agricultural producers, to build out security processes and teams to the equivalent of a Canadian bank. So how are we making, so one of the first things is, like, how are we regulating John Deere to make sure that they have the systems, processes, everything else in place so that they don't get owned and cripple every smart connected tractor in Canada?
Yeah. So that's a great point, because I want to talk a little bit about now vulnerabilities, threats, and consequences. We usually describe cybersecurity risks in terms of these three categories, and across the value chain, from post-farm, essentially focused more in food processing, food production, distribution, retail, food service, etc. What are the main vulnerabilities that company leaders should be aware of? What are the threats you see across the value chain? Maybe for you, Rosita.
Sure. So the threats are enormous, and as you indicated, depending on the stakeholder, the infrastructure they have, the tools they have, So the threat, if it is IoT, obviously the attack surface is much larger. If it is not, then it could be a little bit smaller. But there are vulnerabilities, again, are enormous. So going from phishing campaigns, ransomware attacks, or kind of somehow malware that if they are deployed on your on the devices, on the infrastructure, and also on attacks on the AI system, and also attempts to make the system unavailable using AI algorithms, because AI is becoming very sophisticated. They can predict passwords. They can they can make a system unavailable for short periods of time. There are many different type of attacks that either focus on getting access to very sensitive information, block access, such as ransomware attack to very sensitive information, and also kind of malicious codes that are designed to either make the system unavailable or give access to unauthorized in an unauthorized manner to very sensitive information, or similar, as I mentioned with AI, making an attempt to change the decision, change the outcome of the AI algorithm, which would negatively impact the farmer, various stakeholders within the supply chain, and food security in general. So vulnerabilities again are enormous, and many different stakeholders would be impacted, from the consumer, obviously, on food security type the aspect, and also farmers in terms of how their practices are damaged and how they financially have been impacted. Their reputation could be compromised. So, and then if moving within the supply chain, from farmers to the packager to the transporter, all of those from financial perspective, from reputation perspective, from losing personal data and very kind of unauthorized access to extremely sensitive information, not having access to the infrastructure, which kind of have impact on the operation. So basically, the consequences are enormous. In terms of what industry leaders can do to prepare themselves for this, this is a very big topic, and I know David wants to jump on it. So I'm just briefly talk about it. It's important for us. This has to be a collective, multifaceted approach. Depending on the stakeholders, what type of devices they have, obviously the approach would be different. But some of the generic approaches would be, first of all, security awareness. Making sure that all the staff are aware of the security threats. And this is not a one-time thing, that if you, for example, secure the platform and you'll be done. Technology constantly changes, so everybody has to be up to date about recent changes in the technology, recent threats. So training is absolutely critical. Then if they are using existing cloud provider, they have to make sure they have to bring their digital skills up to the level that they can go through the policy of that cloud provider, review their, making sure it's making sure it's extremely secure, and also proactively. So this is something that's not being done comprehensively. Actively govern and manage data properly. So management, it's not only technology, it's technology, people, and processes all together. So if you have the right technologies in place and you don't have the right protocols in place, your system will not be secure, or privacy will not be preserved. And also, if people are not trained properly, and if they don't have their digital skills are not up at the level, or awareness skills not up at the level that would take proactive actions to protect the infrastructure, again, this would be problematic. So if I want to put it into category of technology, if I want to categorize, I would say technology, process, and people, all of them have to come together to be able to protect the system. Also, human aspect is absolutely critical. For example, at the farm level, the research shows that over 90% of the security and privacy security breaches is because of human error. So at the farm level, for example, because I have been, as one of the roles that I have been looking at our research stations, data. I was managing their data, and I realized there is basically no knowledge of security. Password is shared. So the data is not backed up. Some technology providers back up the data, some don't. Software is not updated. So there are very basic, critical, and known security hygienes that farmers can follow, and also ask the technology provider to kind of make that available in a user-friendly way. Because as David correctly pointed out, we know security is not the priority that farmers think about on a daily basis. So it has to be an easy, a user-friendly, what we call usable security features that have been included in the technologies. But one more comment on, and I think industries, it's absolutely critical, whether they're agri-food industries, some of the points that I brought up, training, proactively managing data, and also security best practices and security standards. There are many standards that, at least from what I have seen, many of these technology providers are not complying with or not using at the farm level. These are very well established for many years, from encryption, from very simple rule, kind of access control, very simple security best practices and standards that they can use, which are not implemented. So I think it's best that we start putting the baseline, raise awareness, make sure data is managed as much as possible to an extent that can protect security. And very important, we have to establish, start using existing standards and best practices and make sure we update them with the new threats. And that would be the basic step that we can take. On the regulatory and compliance perspective, I'll touch on it later on. But yeah.
Well, thanks, Rosita. That's so. It all comes back to the definition of cyber that you mentioned before, David. The convergence between technology, process, and people. And I want to emphasize on the people awareness and education aspect, because from my perspective, that's one of the major vulnerabilities and one of the cheapest one to address if you want, versus investing in heavily in technology without knowing how to use it properly. So David, I know you're probably biting your tongue here because that's what you do for a living. That's what your company does, is to educate people in cybersecurity and risks. So can you give us some examples of these risks and what leaders can do to educate their staff, and what are the possible consequences for the food industry?
Sure. And I think I'll start off with, and I'll work on the education side, and then I'll work back to where Rosita was on the threats and vulnerabilities and add some to her excellent synopsis. So, and I use the word education deliberately. I don't just talk about training our employees, because training is valuable. You can teach people specific skills to apply in specific circumstances. But when we educate our employees about cybersecurity, their role, the issues, etc., we establish a pattern of critical thinking that serves them well, not only in spotting threats and reporting them, but in making decisions about when, where, and how to use technology. And that is truly the seeds that we plant are what we'll harvest for digital security, resilience, and transformation. It won't just be about being secure. It'll be about a culture of security that we can build and maintain. So I think education really is, and to your point, we have seen organizations reduce their likelihood to click on phishing emails by 90% in 90 days by doing automated, randomized phishing tests that gradually get more difficult on a personal level, and by giving people a personal cyber risk score, giving them education that's meaningful, and managing how much time they spend on this versus actually doing their jobs that they need to do, in this case, producing valuable goods in the form of food products. So education is absolutely key. And education for frontline employees is one thing. Education for executives and leaders is another. And so what Rosita has given in a few minutes is a brief masterclass in okay, this is all the stuff that you need to think about. And that's what executives need to be having those conversations on a regular basis. And that's what it means for executives to be in control of technology. What tech are we using? With what data? Protected to what degree? With what controls? And maintained as part of what kind of a living process for people, process, technology. But to step back to that broader picture and to paint a bit of side of things, when we start off as threats, well, threats don't just happen on their own. They're powered by what we colloquially refer to as threat actors. So let's break that down a little bit. We talked about at the start of the call, I mentioned Black Basta, which is a international crime syndicate making hundreds of millions of dollars. So this is business. So you have businesses that profit off of your pain. Those are threat actor number one in my mind for the Canadian industry. And so ways that they're inflicting pain, ransomware. But the other thing we haven't talked about, business email compromise or Beck attacks. These are wire fraud attempts, and these are particularly damning for small and mid-sized businesses when they have tens of thousands of dollars stolen from them and transferred out. The largest successful one in Canada was MacEwan University, and $11 million were fraudulently stolen. Eventually, 10 million of it was recovered back, but it was still an extraordinary moment in Canadian cybercrime. So cyber criminals are the number one group. Number two, I would say, remains nation states. And nation states are interested in two things: disrupting the food supply for whatever geopolitical aims, which we've talked about, or stealing Canadian food innovation. Let's not mistake, and I want to give credit where credit's due. We have some brilliant people throughout the food industry. I mean, you have literally the CFIN and Innovation Network for a reason. There are some cool things happening here. And we have had our intellectual property in Canada absolutely pilfered numerous times, most notably the NRC hack a few years ago. So Canadian innovation being stolen and then us being denied the opportunity to see the full benefits of that would be my next one. So sort of four threats tied to two threat actors. Then I'm going to get into the reality that in competitive businesses, sometimes people cheat. We've seen baseball teams hack other baseball teams. We have a report was shared to me by the RCMP years ago of a farm in Nova Scotia hacking another farm's control management system for how much feed the cows got to lower their dairy output. So we have seen this. So even within our own industry, we may see bad actors happen within that, either competitively or within your organization. This gets overplayed by the cybersecurity industry, the quote unquote insider threat, and it makes people paranoid about all their employees. It's not all your employees. But there is a potential for a few bad apples. We had an interesting case of a small U.S. bank where their IT manager wanted to prove how indispensable he was. So he hijacked their GoDaddy account and their DNS records and took down their website and all their emails. That got him a sweet American jail sentence. So no, not indispensable, but an example of the kind of chaos they may cause by people who aren't having the right processes, which goes back to Rosita's point, making sure you've got best practices around segmentation of duties, who has access to what IT systems, what privileges we have. This is a lot. This is a lot to deal with for an industry that already has a lot to deal with. We talk about the impacts of climate change. We talk about the macroeconomic recessionary conditions, and security has to fit within the puzzle of risks that we manage. But it cannot just be pushed away as that's a problem for the nerds. I'm going to run my business. No, that's a problem for you because you are running a tech company that produces food.
It's interesting how the food industry is heavily regulated in many aspects, in quality, inspection, certifications, financially even sometimes regulated for pricing. But we don't have any regulatory framework for cybersecurity. And what can food company leaders do about that, Rosita? Is there any framework of reference? Is there any government agency that can help them to navigate this framework?
So you see, as correctly pointed out, in terms of cyber security and reporting the incidents and collecting data. So apparently, based on that, and also David confirmed that we don't have a plan yet. It is considered critical infrastructure, but reporting the privacy breaches and security breaches in this sector, privacy they have to report. So I'll get into that quickly. But security we don't have. So I think that would be a major change that if they put in place. And also some oversight because one of the things that I'm very worried about with all the data that is being collected from the food sector, people who have access to it, and if they misuse it, food security, our health or our life would be majorly impacted. I'm not sure if the government sees itself in a position to penalize misuse of farm data. For example, to some of the cases they talk about, farm workers or controlling the market, food price market. So again, I'm not trying to say what government should do, but I think there has to be oversight, and there has to be penalties. But I want to briefly talk about privacy. Privacy is highly regulated, but privacy only deals with personal data. And until now, PIPEDA, which is the act that protects personal data in Canada, was only focused on data that was used for commercial purposes, and farm data or digital act data or consumer data. Yes, it is, especially when they interact with retailers, that is considered sensitive data. So they have to be very cognizant on about how they process personal data. But for example, even farm data, farmers data wasn't included. Regulation, as you know, privacy regulation in Canada is changing. We are also adding, and I think that has been in Europe and other places, AI Act or Artificial Intelligence and Data Act. This is a new one that is coming out. Again, most of these focus on the impact on personal data and impact on individuals. But I think many of these organizations, if you look at these policies and procedures, it would be good to implement, so to just build trust and make sure they're proactively, these industries are addressing the issues proactively. For example, data portability requires data standardization. It's the people, individuals, whether they're farmers or whoever own, whatever ownership means, they can download their data and get access to their data, whenever possible, anonymize their data. So they're very well established, again, standardized practices that these companies that can proactively start using, even if it is not a personal data, or with the potential, for example, the new regulation that's coming out, Digital Charter, will most likely protect some farm data, such as location data. And then they have to protect location data. What if we just protect all the data that's out there? So being transparent, again, some very simple, it's hard to implement, but very well established practices around transparency, data portability, data anonymization, being open about how data is being used, and reporting breaches or keeping track of breaches. I think that would be important. So again, from reporting cybersecurity attacks, there doesn't seem to be regulations or penalties. I'm not quite sure if the data is misused. Privacy, absolutely, but privacy again just refers to personal data protection, which in a few months or a year or two, some farm data would be protected, or it would be expanded to some additional data. And so maybe these companies and industries have to carefully look at what is coming down the pipeline. For example, AI Act, Artificial Intelligence Act, has some requirements that, to me, I think they're quite useful requirements. For example, governance of the AI, which again ensures ethical and responsible use of data, documenting what data goes in, ensuring data is not biased, ensuring the decision is not biased, ensuring the outcome of AI is interpretable. That would limit the type of algorithms that can be used. But again, if these companies have a long list of how to comply or what are the best practices, and if they implement some of those that won't hurt their business, it would be beneficial to protect the individual's privacy, to protect data, or to protect AI from misuse. I think that would be quite useful. So looking at this constantly changing landscape of data protection and trying to comply with it proactively, I think that would be the best direction.
I think Rosita raises a really, really good point. Proactive. And I think the food industry has an opportunity where there's an absence of leadership from Ottawa and focus on the sector to shape its own industry best practices that eventually could become the form of regulation. And I think this is a really interesting point of opportunity. I think, Rosita makes a very clear case for why we need to have good data standards. And this is something industry across Canada has been talking about. We can't get more efficient. We can't leverage the advantages of big data unless we actually can do something with it. When we're doing something with it, we have to know how and when and where we can anonymize it, when we can make it aggregate, when we can reduce the risk around privacy or confidentiality around that to the point where it's no longer a threat to anybody, for example. So there's deep discussions around that. But in practicality, what you're going to see happen is many people, I think you should start with things like the CIS critical controls. So, practical things that your food, particularly if you're a a food processor, packager, a larger firm, if you don't have multi-factor authentication turned on for all of your employees who have access to your IT systems, your financial systems, do it today. It can reduce your risk from brute force attacks by 99.9%. Now, that's not perfect, but 99.9% against brute forcing is a pretty good day. And if you're wondering, well, David, what's a practical example of brute forcing? It was when CRA had to suspend 600,000 Canadians' tax accounts during tax season last year because they were reusing passwords and they had a sophisticated threat actor brute forcing and guessing passwords to break into Canadian tax accounts. So multi-factor authentication, high on my list. Obviously, Nestor, I'm going to say security awareness and training, of which we've partnership with CFIN to help bolster that effort. The next thing I would suggestion after MFA and training people is to actually do a tabletop exercise with your executives and work through things like, what if we suffered a ransomware attack? And the conversations that can come from a good tabletop exercise will spur on the gaps in technology, process, and people. So walk you through that exercise. Get your executives together, buy some pizza, spend 2 hours and say, all of our computers have a ransom note on it. Go. How would we understand the scope of this? How would we deal with this? Would we pay the ransom? By the way, best time to have that conversation is before you actually get ransomed. And who would we call for help? And what does our insurance policy actually cover? So those are my top three kind of, how do you take the brilliant points that Rosita's raised and let's make this a meal that we can actually, act on now and then plan out the rest of the meal plan from that point on.
And make sure you order the pizza from a CFIN member.
I am a fiend for McCain's deep and delicious pizza, so I can give that a wholehearted recommendation.
Perfect. I know we're entering into the last few minutes of the webinar. I have a few questions that I've been capturing from our ecosystem. Why don't we jump into those ones, and I'll throw them to you. You guys decide which one is best for you.
Sure.
So, what is the difference between cybersecurity and information security? Is there any difference in this?
Oh, right to the hot button topic. So I'm going to give my take on it first. So information security, in my view, deals with all forms of information in all formats that we're talking about. So it can be everything from highly inappropriate conversations in airplanes about your company's financial position. I can't tell you how many times I've sat on flights in Toronto and learned all kinds of cool things. So it can be physical documents that people have printed out or shredded or left lying around. And it, of course, can cover digital, but it is very much concerned with the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information. Now, cybersecurity is a specific subset of information security, in my mind, particularly dealing with how humans and technology interact, and thinking about that as the lens. And so that is my bias. There is certainly a vociferous debate among information security professionals. Some hate the word cyber. I am a positive cyber person within the framework of information security. Dr. Dara, I don't know what your take is.
No, I completely agree with you. There are so many different definitions and categorization of this concept. So I want to add another complexity to. So I completely agree with David's point of view and how he defined these two concepts. Also, sometimes I have the discussion with my colleagues around information privacy and information security. So in my opinion, information security is a component of information privacy, because if your system is not secure, you don't have privacy. But once you have security, that doesn't mean you have privacy, because now we talked about regulations. And many of my colleagues who like to refer to cyber security textbook, they don't agree with this definition. So we all can have our own definitions. I think we are just fine. And David's the definition was excellent. So
yeah. and actually, Rosita, you point to a really interesting relationship. The most success I ever had running the security program for the University of New Brunswick is when I had strong relationships as the security lead with our privacy through our university secretariat and with our risk management office. And risk management had to deal with all kinds of risk. But the three of us together were able to support each other. Sometimes there was budget and risk management that would fund privacy initiatives or security initiatives. So when you can build allies across business units and those things function well together, and my friend Ann Kavukian, Dr. Kavukian, she makes the point that security and privacy are different sides of the same coin. You got to have both.
Yeah, exactly. So I worked with Dr. Kavukian when I was working at the IPC for a year and a half. So the view that security is part of privacy is basically her view, and I like it. So I everywhere I use it, but it's not in the textbook. So maybe we should start writing a textbook and make it and make that kind of standard definition, another standard definition.
So here's another good one. I'm a small business owner of a food production company. Where do I start to educate myself and protect my company?
I'll go first. I think attending events like this and getting a kind of a survey of the issues is a great place to start. And then I think it comes back to using some simple frameworks. I think one of the things you could go back and say, okay, well, if I've laid out the example of what would happen if someone fooled us into wiring X amount of money, well, that would end my business. Okay, well, what are the things I would put in place to prevent someone from being able to fool us from wiring that kind of money? What are the checks and balances I do? Okay, great. If all of our computers went away, we'd be fine for 2 weeks. So we could afford to bring somebody in to replace them, to re-image, et cetera, or be done. Okay, if we'd be done, do we have insurance to help us get through that? So listening to the things that we've raised today and then asking yourself, which can be deeply uncomfortable questions, that can help you prioritize those risks. That's the easy way that I would say as a business owner. And if you're doing really cool AI stuff, I would be listening very carefully to what Dr. Dara is saying about what would happen if these machines that are machine learning themselves go rogue on you. How would that affect your business?
That's right. Rosita, rapid fire now that we're in the last 5 minutes. How I do identify or quantify the most important assets in my company?
Yep. So there are best practices that are out there if somebody looks for it. So basically looking at what assets are in the company from infrastructure, data, and starting to categorize the asset into different groups, because some data could be quite sensitive, but maybe they're personal data, so they're highly regulated, they fall under a different bucket. Some of them are restricted data for the organization. It may not be by default a very sensitive information for the organization is, and then categorizing them into different high sensitivity, low sensitivity. That's just for data. Identifying other infrastructure that are quite valuable, software, hardware, all of those. And then obviously then we need to start have a plan, plan for how train or educate the staff, then plan to secure and protect all of these data, and going over, does any regulation apply to the data that I have? What type of infrastructure, software, and tool I need to put, access control mechanism, authentication I need to put in place, encryption, and all of that. So that's, again, for data, highly sensitive, low sensitivity data. We cannot also look at the data flow, because as the data flow sensitivity level changes, as you aggregate it, it may not be as sensitive, or it may be even more sensitive. So all of those needs to be considered. And also how to secure the infrastructure physically and with technology, and what protocols and processes needs to be put in place to secure them. Again, as I mentioned, people, process, and technology, all of those need to come together. So mapping out everything you have, categorizing them, identifying very, as greatly pointed out by David, who may be interested in what, the attackers, the intruders, and then would it be financially driven or whatever, and accordingly putting the right tools in place to protect it. Intrusion detection prevention plans, those are some of the technologies that exist. If consultants could be hired, if technologies could be purchased, and they could be used in the right way, those are they would be impactful.
Thank you, Rosita. So we're getting to the end of the webinar. I have more questions here. Unfortunately, we're gonna run out of time. But I want to thank you very much to both of you for your participation, your insights, and it's been invaluable. It's been a learning journey for me as well. Any last comments, words that you want to leave with with the audience, with the Canadian Food Innovation Network members today?
Sure. I'll go forward is that like being part of a network like this is the first step to figuring out complex issues. So Nestor, thanks for the opportunity to be here. Obviously, I'm very keenly aware of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and I very much enjoy my Canadian food products to survive. So thanks for the opportunity to give back to the network and help in this area. You're not alone. There are a ton of resources. You can advance in this issue, and you can do this collectively. And in fact, probably the only way to be truly successful is to work on this together as a group.
Thank you. Sita?
Thank you very much for having me very briefly. And it was a very informative session for me as well. I learned a lot from David.
Thank you. I learned a lot from you too, Rosita. Thanks for the opportunity to be a co-panelist, and apologies, Nestor, for the tech challenges, but we overcame, and this was a ton of fun.
Yeah,
it wouldn't be a webinar without a little bit of technical challenges.
Yeah. So thank you very much for having me. Yeah, thanks a lot.
Thank you, both of you, Rosita and David.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Goodbye now.
Bye.